You feel the weight of what is wrong with the world, and you do not know what to do with the weight. The environmental crisis, the fraying of communities, the political complexity that makes every large problem seem intractable. You carry the awareness of all of this, and the awareness has produced not energy, but a specific, paralyzing combination of guilt and helplessness. You know it matters. You do not know what one person doing one thing in one place can possibly contribute to problems of this scale. And so you carry the weight without acting, or you act in ways that feel inadequate to the scale of what needs addressing. Or you have found a way to not carry the weight at all, to manage the awareness down to a level that does not produce the paralysis, which is its own kind of loss. Wangari Maathai, the Kenyan environmental and political activist who founded the Green Belt movement, who was imprisoned and beaten for her work, who received the Nobel Peace Prize in 2004 as the first African woman to do so, said something about this that cuts through the paralysis without dismissing the scale of the problem. She said, "It's the little things citizens do. That's what will make the difference. My little thing is planting trees." Not because trees solve everything, because the person who is planting trees is not paralyzed. The person who has found the specific, local, immediate, actually available thing that they can do and is doing it, has found the answer to the question that the weight of the world keeps making unanswerable. What can one person do? One person can plant a tree, and then another. And the Green Belt movement planted 51 million trees across Kenya, starting with one woman and one tree. There is a specific despair that serious people who care about the world produce in themselves. Not the despair of indifference, that is a different and in some way simpler problem. The despair of the person who cares deeply and has concluded from the evidence of the scale of the problems and the pace of the solutions that the caring is not sufficient to produce the change. The person who knows what is at stake and who feels, in the face of what is at stake, something close to powerlessness, who has done the calculation between the problem's size and the individual's capacity and found the calculation unfavorable. This despair is, in its way, rational. The problems are as large as they appear to be. The individual is as small as it appears to be. The calculation is not wrong. But Wangari Maathai looked at this despair and found in it a philosophical error. Not about the scale of the problem, about the nature of action. The despair that calculates the individual's contribution against the problem's full scale is the despair of the person who has accepted that the only meaningful action is the action that solves everything, the action that by itself is sufficient to the whole problem. And since no individual action meets this standard, the conclusion is that no individual action is worth taking.
She spent her life arguing the opposite. Not because she was naive about the scale of what needed to change. She was arrested, assaulted, imprisoned, faced the full hostility of a government that understood her work as a threat. She was not naive. She was philosophically precise about the relationship between the individual act and the collective change. The individual act does not solve the problem. It changes the person who does it. And the person who has been changed by the doing, who has moved from paralyzed awareness to engaged action, however small, is a different person from the one who carries the weight without acting. And the different person produces different effects, and the different effects across enough different people produce the movement. The 51 million trees begin with one tree, but they also begin with one person who decided to plant instead of despair. Wangari Maathai was born in 1940 in Nyeri, in the highlands of Kenya, in the shadow of Mount Kenya. She grew up in the generation that witnessed both the end of British colonial rule and the complicated, often painful realities of independence. She was educated partly through the Catholic Church's educational mission, received a scholarship to study in the United States in 1960, studying biology in Kansas and Pittsburgh, and returned to Kenya to pursue a doctorate at the University of Nairobi, where she became, in 1971, the first woman in East and Central Africa to earn a PhD. She joined the faculty of the University of Nairobi, eventually becoming the first woman to chair a department in the university's history. She was active in the National Council of Women of Kenya, and in 1977, observing the environmental degradation that was accelerating across Kenya, the deforestation, the soil erosion, the drying of rivers, the displacement of communities that depended on the land, she organized a tree planting event on World Environment Day that grew into the Green Belt movement. The movement's premise was simple, and its implications were radical. Trees stop soil erosion. Trees restore watersheds. Trees provide fuel and food and shade. Trees hold communities together around the shared work of planting and tending them. And women, who in rural Kenya were most directly affected by the environmental degradation, who walked further for firewood, who collected water from drying sources, who fed families from soil that was losing its fertility, were the ones who would plant the trees. The Green Belt movement paid women a small amount for each seedling they grew and each tree they planted that survived. It created nurseries, trained environmental educators, built a network that eventually spanned more than 6,000 nurseries and employed tens of thousands of women across Kenya. And it produced, in the women who participated, something that the tree planting alone could not fully explain: a quality of confidence, of civic engagement, of the specific sense of agency that comes from having done something visible and lasting in the place where you live. Wangari was not only an environmentalist, she was a political activist. She recognized, with the clarity of someone who had thought carefully about the relationship between environmental degradation and political oppression, that the destruction of the environment and the destruction of democracy were not separate problems. Both were products of the same dynamic, the extraction of resources by those with power at the expense of those without it. The women who planted trees were not only restoring the land, they were practicing the democracy that their government was not providing, making decisions about the land they lived on, exercising the power that the political system denied them, building the communities that the market and the state were dismantling. She was arrested multiple times. She was beaten by security forces at a protest in Uhuru Park in 1992, when she and other women were demanding the release of political prisoners. She ran for parliament and was defeated through electoral fraud. She ran again in 2002 and won with 98% of the vote. She served as Deputy Environment Minister. She received the Nobel Peace Prize in 2004. The Nobel Committee noting that she had taken a holistic approach to sustainable development that embraced democracy, human rights, and women's rights in particular. She died in 2011 at 71 from ovarian cancer. She had planted trees for 34 years. The philosophy in the planting. 3 ideas from Maathai's life and writing that constitute a philosophy of hope as practice rather than feeling.
The first is the hummingbird. In a story she told often, the forest is on fire. All the animals stand at the edge watching, helpless, except for the hummingbird, who flies to the river, picks up a drop of water in its beak and drops it on the fire, flies back, picks up another drop, drops it on the fire. The other animals mock it. What do you think you can do? The hummingbird says, I am doing the best I can. This is not a story about the hummingbird solving the problem. The fire is much larger than the drop. It is a story about the relationship between the individual act and the individual character. The hummingbird is not paralyzed. The hummingbird is not waiting for a more adequate response. The hummingbird is doing the best it can. And in the doing, in the specific, available, immediately present act, the hummingbird is the only one who is actually engaged with the problem, rather than observing it from the paralyzed outside. The philosophy is not that the hummingbird's drop will put out the fire. It is that the person who acts despite the inadequacy of the act is a different person from the person who does not act, and the different person produces different effects, and the effects accumulated across enough different people are the beginning of what changes the world. The second idea is the connection between the environment and the self. Maathai argued, and the Greenbelt movement demonstrated, that the restoration of the environment and the restoration of the human community are not separate projects. The women who planted trees were not only restoring trees, they were restoring themselves, recovering the specific kind of agency and dignity that comes from taking care of the place you live in, rebuilding the relationships between community members that the shared work of planting and tending and protecting produces. This is the philosophy of place. The self that has a genuine, ongoing, tending relationship with a specific piece of the earth, a garden, a neighborhood, a watershed, a community, is a different self from the one that passes through places without putting anything into them. It is more rooted, more grounded, more genuinely present in its own life. The environmental restoration is also, always, the self-restoration. The tree planted is also, in the full Maathai understanding, a claim about belonging, the specific, embodied, visible claim that this is my place and I take care of it. The third idea is the long horizon. Planting a tree is an act of faith in the future. Trees grow slowly. The person who plants a tree is acting for a future they may or may not live to see. This is the philosophical position of a person who has made peace with their own smallness in the time frame of the problems they are addressing, who has accepted that their contribution is a contribution, a real addition to the world, without being the solution, who has decided that acting for the future that will exist after them is worth doing even though they will not be there to see the full result. This is the Cato move, planting for posterity, applied to the specific political environmental urgency of the present, and it is the answer to the paralysis that comes from calculating the problem scale against the individual contribution. You do not need to solve the problem to make your contribution to the solution. You need to make your contribution. Plant the tree. That is what faith in the future looks like when it has been translated into action. Now, the bridge. Because Maathai was a Kenyan environmentalist and political activist working in the specific context of post-colonial Kenya, African environmental degradation, and the specific struggles of rural Kenyan women. But here is what translates directly. The weight you are carrying and the paralysis it is producing. The awareness of what is wrong that has not become action. The calculation between the problem scale and your individual capacity that keeps coming out unfavorable. The tree you have not planted because you have been waiting for an action adequate to the full problem.
Maathai is not telling you to stop caring about the full problem. She is telling you to start acting on the available portion of it. Not the portion that solves everything, the portion that is actually, specifically, immediately available to you. The specific, local, tangible thing that the person at your particular position in the world can actually do. The hummingbird's drop is real. It does not put out the fire by itself. It is real. It contributes. And the person who drops the water is a different person from the one who stands at the edge. And the different person, the engaged person, the acting person, produces a different life and a different world than the paralyzed observer. What is your tree? Here is what Wangari Maathai asks of you, practically, today. First, find the specific, local, available thing. Not the global solution, the specific, immediate, actually available thing the thing that the person at your particular position in your particular place can actually do, the tree you can plant, not as a metaphor, as the actual, physical, tangible act that puts something into the world rather than only observing what has been taken out. For some people, this is literally a tree. For others, it is the mentorship, the vote, the community meeting attended, the organization supported with time rather than only money, the neighborhood relationship maintained, the skill shared, the voice used where it is available to be used. Find the specific thing, the hummingbird's drop. What is your drop? Second, act in the face of inadequacy. The Maathai practice is not waiting until the action is adequate to the problem. It is acting in the full, clear-eyed acknowledgement that the action is not adequate to the problem, and acting anyway. Because the action that is taken is better than the action that is not taken, regardless of whether the taken action solves the problem. Because the person who acts is different from the person who does not act in ways that matter both for the individual and for the world. Find one thing you have been not doing on the grounds that it is inadequate to the scale of the problem it is addressing, and do it, not because it will solve the problem, because it is your drop, and the drop is real.
Third, tend one specific place. The Maathai philosophy of the connection between environmental restoration and personal restoration. Find one specific, local, particular place, a garden, a section of a park, a community space, a neighborhood, and commit to tending it, not impressively, consistently. The ongoing, patient, tending relationship with a piece of the physical world that is available to you. The self that tends a place is different from the self that passes through places, more rooted, more genuinely present in its own life, more connected to the long, slow, living processes that the restless, screen-mediated, placeless modern life tends to lose contact with. The garden is not a retreat from the problems of the world. In Maathai's understanding, it is the practice of being in genuine relationship with the world, the beginning of the belonging that makes the larger engagement possible. Fourth, plant for the future that comes after you. The long horizon. Find one act, one investment, one relationship tended, one seed planted in whatever form that is directed toward a future you may not live to see. The mentorship of the person who will carry something forward, the community institution maintained for the generation that will need it. The act of the person who has accepted that the contribution does not require the contributor's presence to complete. This is not self-abnegation. It is the specific, philosophically serious act of the person who has understood that the self is embedded in time in a way that extends beyond the individual life, and who has decided to act accordingly. The tree planted for the shade it will provide, the future trusted with the seed. I want to close with the image of Wangari Maathai that stays with me. Not the Nobel Prize acceptance, not the arrest or the beatings or the 98% electoral victory. The first tree. 1977, World Environment Day. A small group of women in Nairobi. 7 trees planted in the backyard of the National Council of Women. The first 7 trees of the 51 million, the beginning that was, from the outside, entirely disproportionate to what would follow. The hummingbird's first drop. She did not know, planting those 7 trees, what the movement would become. She knew that the land was being degraded, and that women were suffering from the degradation, and that trees were a real response to a real problem. She knew how to plant a tree, so she planted one. And then another. And 51 million trees later, she received the Nobel Peace Prize, not the Nobel Prize for the environment, but for peace. The committee having understood what Maathai had been saying all along, that the health of the land and the health of the community and the health of the democracy are not separate problems. They are the same problem, and the person who plants a tree is addressing all of them. The first tree was planted in 1977. It is still growing. What are you planting? Here is the question Wangari Maathai leaves us with today. Not from the Nobel podium, not from the prison cell or the courthouse or the assembly in Uhuru Park, from the nursery, from the woman who looked at the degraded land and the degraded democracy and found in the specific, tangible, immediately available act of planting a tree the answer to the question that the weight of the world keeps making unanswerable. What is your tree? What is the specific, local, available, actually doable thing that the person at your particular position in the world can do? Not to solve everything, but to be the hummingbird, to be the person who is doing the best they can instead of the person standing at the edge of the burning forest. And when will you plant it? Leave that in the comments, because naming the tree is the beginning of the planting, and the planting, one tree, then another, is how 51 million trees happen, one person at a time, doing the best they can. I'll see you in the next one.